Welcome to today's video. Join me as we explore one of the most mysterious and profound stories in ancient Egyptian history, the 10 Plagues of Egypt. This story is not only a historical event, but also deeply spiritual, reflecting God's punishment of Pharaoh and the land of Egypt for not freeing the Israelites from slavery. In this video, we will walk through each plague that God brought upon Egypt, from the first signs to the ultimate deliverance of the Israelites. Each plague is not just a physical punishment, but also a profound lesson about God's power, justice, and the impotence of rulers when they go against his will. We will delve into the details of these plagues and the related historical events. Additionally, we will connect them with spiritual meanings, helping you gain a deeper understanding of the message this story aims to convey. Get ready for an exciting journey through historical events and the wonders of Egyptian mythology as we uncover the plagues God sent. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next captivating stories. Let's begin now. Plague 1. Turning the Nile River into blood. The first plague that God brought upon Egypt was turning the waters of the Nile River into blood. The Nile River, a symbol of life and prosperity for Egypt, was the main water source for agriculture and daily life. However, when God commanded, all the water in the Nile, from the main river to the canals, turned into blood. The people could no longer use this water to drink, bathe, or carry out any activities, as it became polluted and toxic. This event not only caused great suffering for the people of Egypt, but also severely damaged the economy, as agriculture relied heavily on the Nile's water. It was the first sign of judgment, as Pharaoh refused to relent and free the Israelites from slavery. This also served as the first lesson about God's infinite power and humanity's helplessness when faced with spiritual strength. Plague 2. Frogs overrun the land. The second plague that God brought upon Egypt was the appearance of millions of frogs everywhere. The frogs did not only appear along the banks of the Nile River, but also invaded homes, bedrooms, and dining areas, causing chaos and discomfort for the people of Egypt. Although Pharaoh asked Moses to pray to God to stop the plague, God did not respond until Pharaoh had no other option. The appearance of the frogs was not just a hygiene issue, but also an invasion of impurity into the lives of the Egyptians. Each frog was seen as a sign of disturbance and unease. This served as a strong reminder of human weakness in the face of God's supreme power, as Pharaoh continued to harden his heart and refused to free the Israelites. Plague 3. Swarms of flies and insects. The third plague that God sent upon Egypt was a massive swarm of flies and insects, completely overwhelming the land. These creatures didn't just destroy crops, they went after people and livestock too, making everyday life unbearable. Everywhere you turned, there were flies and bugs crawling through homes, workplaces, and public areas, turning the entire country into one big mess. Even though Pharaoh begged Moses and Aaron to ask God to stop the plague, God wasn't swayed and kept the pests coming, leaving the Egyptians to suffer. This wasn't just an invasion of annoying insects. It was a deep, symbolic invasion of sin and destruction into the heart of Egyptian society. It shook their way of life, disrupting everything from agriculture to daily routines. This plague also served as another warning about Pharaoh's stubbornness and his refusal to repent. Even with everything falling apart around him, he still resisted God's will, showing just how far his pride had taken him. Plague 4. The plague on livestock. The fourth plague that God brought upon Egypt was a devastating disease that struck the livestock of the Egyptians. Cattle, donkeys, sheep, goats, and other animals suddenly fell ill and died in large numbers. This was a major catastrophe, directly impacting Egypt's agricultural and livestock economy, as animals were valuable assets that provided food and labor for the people. This plague not only caused material loss, but also forced the Egyptians to confront a spiritual crisis. Meanwhile, the Israelites were spared from this disaster, highlighting the clear distinction between God's people and the Egyptians. Even though Pharaoh remained stubborn and refused to listen, this plague once again emphasized God's supreme power and Pharaoh's helplessness in the face of divine authority. Plague 5. Boils. The fifth plague was the outbreak of painful boils all over the bodies of the Egyptians. These sores appeared on the skin, affecting everyone from common people to the nobles. No one was spared. The boils caused itching, swelling, and intense pain, making it impossible for the Egyptians to work or carry on with their daily activities. This plague was not just a physical ailment, but also a form of spiritual punishment, representing the impurity and sinfulness of Egypt. Although Pharaoh pleaded with Moses and Aaron to pray for God to remove the plague, God did not relent, affirming his absolute power. The boils served as a symbol of rejection and judgment, showing that the Egyptians could not escape divine punishment as long as they refused to heed God's commands. Plague 6, Hail and Fire. The sixth plague that God sent upon Egypt was a fierce hailstorm accompanied by fire. The hailstones, as large as broken rocks, fell from the sky, destroying crops, trees, and the property of the Egyptians. Along with the hail, fire consumed everything that wasn't shielded, causing tremendous devastation. This hailstorm was not only a natural disaster, but also a sign of God's judgment against Egypt for refusing to free the Israelites. Although Pharaoh once again begged Moses to pray for God to end the plague, God did not change his decision. This plague made a powerful statement. Pharaoh's arrogance and stubbornness could not stand against God's infinite power. Plague 7, the Locust Swarm. The seventh plague was the arrival of a massive locust swarm that overran Egypt. The dense clouds of locusts flew down from the sky, covering the land and devouring everything in their path, from trees and crops to even the food reserves of the people. The entire country of Egypt was plunged into famine, as all agricultural resources were completely destroyed. This devastation was not only an agricultural disaster, but also an economic and psychological shock for the Egyptians. Despite Pharaoh's refusal to free the Israelites, God continued to send the plagues, asserting his supreme power. The locust swarm served as a wake-up call to Pharaoh about his helplessness in the face of God's infinite power, and that the punishment would not stop until the Israelites were set free. Plague 8, Darkness over Egypt. The eighth plague was the appearance of thick darkness that covered Egypt for 3 days. The people could not see anything, as everything around them was engulfed in complete darkness. No one could move or work, and the sunlight was completely obscured, creating a sense of gloom and despair. This darkness not only disrupted all daily and economic activities in Egypt, but also carried a profound spiritual meaning, symbolizing a loss of direction and a lack of spiritual light. The Egyptians were separated from the light, representing their estrangement from God's illumination. Meanwhile, the Israelites lived in the light, affirming God's protection and the distinction between his people and the rebels. This plague emphasized God's supreme power, showing that even light itself must yield to his will. Plague 9, the death of the firstborn. The ninth plague was the most painful and devastating of all, as the death of the firstborn struck every household in Egypt. God commanded that all firstborns of the Egyptians, from Pharaoh's own son to the firstborn of livestock, would die that night. Every family was faced with the unimaginable pain of losing their young children, as their lives were suddenly taken away. The death of the firstborns was the final punishment and a sign of atonement for the pride and crimes that Pharaoh and the Egyptians had committed against the Israelites. Pharaoh, who had stubbornly refused to release the Israelites, despite many warnings, was forced to witness the inescapable despair and loss. Although he held supreme power, that power was meaningless in the face of God's infinite might. However, the Israelites were protected from this plague. God provided them with a special sign. The blood of a lamb placed on their doorposts would serve as a signal for the angel of death to pass over their homes. This symbolized God's protection of the Israelites, showing that when they followed his commands, they would be spared from disaster. The death of the firstborn was a clear sign of God's justice. The final judgment upon Egypt was inevitable, and Pharaoh had to endure the greatest loss to realize God's infinite power. This was the moment when Pharaoh's hard heart finally accepted the release of the Israelites, paving the way for their freedom and ending the slavery they had endured for so many years. Plague 10, the liberation of the Israelites. The 10th and final plague was the liberation of the Israelites from Pharaoh's enslavement, a profoundly significant event that marked a new chapter in the history of this nation. After enduring 10 terrifying plagues, Pharaoh could no longer resist God's power and was forced to admit defeat. Although his heart still harbored anger and disdain, he had no other choice but to allow the Israelites to leave. God commanded the Israelites to prepare for a great migration, taking their wealth and livestock with them, and instructed them to leave Egypt quickly, without hindrance. The Israelites were not only freed from slavery, but also given a new opportunity to rebuild their lives and journey toward the promised land that God had promised to their ancestors. Pharaoh had to stand and watch as the Israelites departed, and in that moment, he realized that his power before God was meaningless. This story reflects God's absolute justice. Those who are arrogant and oppressive must pay the price, while the oppressed are freed by God. It is also a powerful lesson about God's infinite power and the protection he offers to those who follow his will. The Israelites, after years of slavery and suffering, were now free, embarking on a new journey to build a community under God's guidance. They were not only liberated from Egypt, but were also taught and led by God on the right path, becoming a nation with a strong faith in God's power. The liberation of the Israelites is a powerful testament to the fact that God's power cannot be resisted, and salvation only comes to those who listen and trust in him. This was the ultimate outcome that Pharaoh and Egypt had to face, as they could no longer keep the Israelites in bondage. Conclusion. Through the 10 plagues that God sent upon Egypt, we not only witnessed devastation and suffering, but also saw a powerful message about God's supreme power. Each plague was not just a material punishment, but also a lesson about justice, salvation, and the helplessness of the arrogant when they go against God's will. Pharaoh, despite his great power, ultimately had to surrender to God's infinite strength. Meanwhile, the Israelites, who had been enslaved for many years, were liberated and led into a new journey full of hope. This story is not just a part of history, but also carries deep spiritual value and teaches lessons of patience, faith, and reverence for God's power. When we face challenges and difficulties in life, the lesson from this story helps us recognize that salvation always comes to those who trust and persevere. Thank you for watching this video and joining me in exploring the story of the 10 plagues in Egypt. If you found this story interesting and helpful, don't forget to like and share so others can learn as well. Please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss future videos on profound historical and spiritual stories. I wish you always find light and hope in every situation. See you in the next videos.